Baroness, and thank you for that very embarrassing introduction. I would like to introduce myself a little more like me. All I say about myself is I'm actually a nurse and a social scientist by intention and a baroness by astonishment. I wasn't born a baroness, and I wasn't in the political world. I was the first baroness I'd ever met. But you become a baroness by being appointed to the House of Lords, like the upper chamber in other bicameral parliaments. And I thought, God, what are you doing? But how do I use this privilege? And the message came very clearly: to speak in Parliament is a wonderful place to be a voice for those whose voices are not heard. And so that's how I tried to use my role in the House of Lords. And I hope there's going to be a PowerPoint coming up, because I want to get out of the way. But if you're not sitting somewhere where you can see either the side screens, please do go, because I'm going to invite you to travel with me to some of our wonderful partners on the front lines of faith and freedom. So if you can see the screen, that's fine. If you can't, please do move, because I want to show pictures, because they often remain as a focus for prayers after evanescent words disappear. So I'm going to move so I can see what I'm showing you, and please do look, if you will, because you'll see some wonderful people. Thank you. Sorry. No, it's fine. No, it's fine. I'll stand here, because that's very kind of you. Thank you. All right. Okay. Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you, Patrick. In order to fulfill that mandate, I established an organization, HEART, Humanitarian Aid Relief Trust, to provide aid and advocacy for those suffering from oppression and persecution who are largely neglected by international organizations for political reasons or for security reasons. Next slide, please. I'm going to begin in Armenia, not because obviously most people here aren't aware of all that's been happening in your wonderful nation and in the related nation of Artsakh, but for those who do not know Armenia, just a little bit of background. As we've heard many times, and we know, Armenia suffered the first major genocide of the last century. 1.5 million Armenians were murdered by Turkey. And Karabakh, or Artsakh, is an Armenian enclave located by Stalin in Azerbaijan, whose people resisted ethnic cleansing in a bitter war from 1990 to 94. Azeri brutality and war crimes in that war included, I was there many times, 400 Grad missiles a day being fired onto Stepanakert, a civilian target, a war crime. I have photos of children shredded by cluster bombs, another war crime to fire cluster bombs on civilians. Next slide, please. And this is a picture in Stepanakert of one of the buildings hit by Grad. 400 a day. You can imagine what Stepanakert was like. Azerbaijan also used 500-kilogram bombs to destroy homes and kill civilians. Next slide, please. And the next slide shows, very sadly, the remains of one of the homes in Stepanakert that had been hit by one of those huge bombs. The two men have come in from the front line, because the man in the blue jeans, it's his home, and under the pile of rubble are his pregnant wife and 2 little girls. Next slide, please. But there are also a miracle of protection. Next slide, please. One of the most holy places is the wonderful cathedral at Gandzazar. And Azerbaijan, as we know, is determined to destroy sacred places. And again, Azeri aircraft flew over Gandzazar, and they dropped their bombs. All of them fell not on the cathedral, but on the neighboring monastic outbuildings, except one. And this one never exploded. It's imploded in the wall of a monastic outbuilding, and so that cathedral remains, in spite of Azeri intention to destroy it, intact to this day. And we pray that will happen to the other sacred buildings in Artsakh in the developing situation. Next slide, please. New life. You Armenians are wonderful people at creating new life. Hope and healing for the hopeless, beauty from the ashes of destruction. Next slide, please. After the ceasefire, we asked in HEART, it is our principle to ask people your priority for help. We don't tell you what we're going to do, we ask them. And the leadership in Artsakh emphasized the need for rehabilitation for people with disabilities. They gave us a bombed-out old school building to establish the center. There were virtually no buildings in Stepanakert which were not bombed. Next slide, please. And this is the building that they gave us in those days. Next slide, please. And our wonderful hero of peace, Vardan Tativosyan, who's there in the red trousers, He has changed that bombed-out old building into an internationally recognized center of excellence for rehabilitation. It is internationally recognized. People come from the world to visit it. And recently, the director of the International Committee of the Red Cross in Karabakh went to visit it and claimed it was 40 years ahead of any rehabilitation center she'd seen in many of the countries where she had worked. You Armenian people are wonderful people at creating hope and beauty out of the ashes of destruction. Next slide, please. Last October, as we all know, Azerbaijan unleashed a new war on Karabakh, supported by Turkey, with massive military resources, including further illegal use of cluster bombs and targeting civilians with drones. Next slide, please. Reverend David Thomas, who's here, my colleague, and I visited the area. We witnessed the destruction of civilian targets as a war crime, including the maternity hospital, the electricity power station, leaving people sheltering in basements without heat or light. Next slide, please. This was the maternity hospital, deliberately targeted. Next slide, please. This is the power station, deliberately targeted, leaving people without any light or heat. There we see Vardan, the hero of the peace, who transformed that old building into a center of excellence, and my colleague, Reverend David Thomas, who'll see around. But a major priority now is to end Azerbaijan's impunity and to promote the release of the Armenian prisoners that have been held and are still being held by Azerbaijan. There have been harrowing cases where Azeri soldiers have captured Armenians, taken their phones, and taken videos of torturing and executing the prisoner, sending the photos back to the family. One of the ladies whom I met in Armenia last time, who'd lost her husband, said she did not dare to look at her phone. Next slide, please. A major priority now is to end Azerbaijan's impunity and to promote the release of Armenian prisoners of war, so far, tragically, without success. I have produced a publication on that with all the evidence. I thought I was speaking this afternoon. I had it available, but if you'd like to see it, I'm very happy to give you a copy. Next slide, please. Okay, we're moving now. Seatbelts on, we're moving far and fast because time is short. And I thought I had 20 minutes, only have 15, so we're going to move very fast. But examples of other places where HEART has the privilege of supporting local partners in extremely challenging situations of war and persecution. Next slide, please. We're going to begin, I think, in Burma, or Myanmar, we call it Burma, because they prefer that. Next slide, please. Here we are. The dreadful suffering of the Rohingya people is well known, but the suffering of the Shan and the Kachin people in eastern Burma is not publicized. Much aid has been transferred to the Rohingya, exacerbating the suffering of the Shan and Kachin peoples with whom we work. Next slide, please. And here we are in Kachin state, and the villages are all built of wood, and so the bombs, which are very frequent, just everything goes up, and you're left with devastation and destruction. Next slide, please. Hundreds of thousands have been driven from their homes to take, the phrase came to me, the long road to nowhere. Where do you go? The same field people had to flee from Artsakh. Where do you go? And we asked children to draw, and this little lad has drawn his picture of his world. Interesting, he writes in English, but that's his world. But there is a light in the darkness, and the light in the darkness is rather like Vardan in Artsakh. Dr. Sasa from the Chin Hill tribes qualified as a doctor in Armenia in his fifth language 15 years ago and returned to his people. His vision was to train community health workers, CHWs, provide life-saving healthcare for villages deep inside Chin State. It's remote stuff in the jungle where there's no access and there was no healthcare at all. Next slide. After graduating in June, about 15 years ago, we were there for his graduation, he returned to his people. They cleared the dense jungle, built a training center, sent messages to over 150 villages, inviting them to elect a man and a woman to come to train as CHWs. Next. By November, everything was ready, pretty good between June and November. 317 students have walked through the jungles, no roads, from 153 villages to begin their training. Some had walked 5 to 7 days. Next slide, please. And we were there for the opening, and it was an amazing achievement in 4 months. Next slide, please. And it had textbooks sent up from Rangoon, a huge enterprise, 1,000 textbooks through the jungle over the mountains. That's Dr. Sasa. We revisited for their graduation a year later. Our medical advisor, who specializes in tropical diseases, said that the CHWs had the knowledge to save the lives of 8 out of 10 people in their villages who would previously have died. And it's treatable, they treat. What's preventable, they prevent. Over 1,000 have now completed their training. 500 villages benefit from the activities of these CHWs, who continue to save the lives of 8 out of 10 people with a catchment area of 250,000. From nothing to 250,000 is wonderful. Next slide, please. And there's Dr. Sasa, and there's every little white dot on that map of Chin State and going down to Rakhine State is where the community health workers are working. But recently, as you will know, the Burmese army has overthrown the democratic elected government, imprisoning members. The others are in hiding. The military has shot hundreds, and it's going up every day, of innocent civilians. A reign of terror prevails. And Dr. Sasser just managed to escape, and he's now appointed by the elected government in hiding to serve as their international envoy. You may see him on television. He's been inspirational in his advocacy at the highest levels. Also, you can pray for him, please. He's been named a traitor by the military, so he's at constant risk of assassination. Next slide, please. We're moving on fast now in just a few minutes in each of these countries. South Sudan, we've been working for many years. Next slide, please. South Sudan suffered a war inflicted by the Islamist regime in Khartoum from 1989 to 2005, in which 2 million perished, 4 million were displaced, and tens of thousands of women and children abducted into slavery. And Dr. John Eibner, who's here, was with me on many of those visits, rescuing those slaves. Next slide, please. Systematic slavery was used as a weapon of war, and as many thousands were enslaved. I was in Abyei, it's between Sudan and South Sudan last year, and I met a young man who said, "Are you Lady Cox?" He said, wanted to meet me all his life to thank us because we had rescued him from, and many others, from slavery. And so this is a particularly important one for John. This is one of the people we were enabled to rescue from slavery. Next slide, please. A peace agreement was signed in 2005, brought some peace for South Sudan, referendum of independence, celebration of the birth of the new nation in 2011. Next slide, please. But the jihad war left South Sudan devastated, destitute. Civil wars created new tragedies and massive displacement. Next slide, please. And this is just a picture in one of the camps for the people that are displaced, and that's someone's home. Come the rainy season, it will last about 2 minutes. Next slide, please. Sudan itself, that's the old North Sudan, that we visit there, we work with the people there. Next slide, please. And the president of Sudan, previous one, al-Bashir, adopted genocidal policies of ethnic and religious cleansing of Africans and non-Islamist Muslims in Blue Nile, southern Kordofan, and Darfur, the 3 areas. Next slide, please. With Khartoum's constant air bombardment of civilians in the Nubian Mountains and Blue Nile, 250,000 were displaced, hiding in caves with deadly snakes. 250,000 fled as refugees into South Sudan. Next slide, please. In January 2017, we visited civilians in the Nubian Mountains who were forced by constant air bombardment to flee from their homes and live in caves with deadly snakes. Next slide, please. This is one of the caves that they were living in, and they said that when the bombers come, 50 people will crowd into that cave with deadly snakes. In January 2018, we visited Blue Nile, met 9,000 displaced people at risk of dying from starvation. We raised 50,000, we were tiny NGOs, only 5 of us, for emergency food aid. It was delivered, but it would save a lot of lives. £27 will feed a family of 7 for 3 months until the rainy season comes. So it saved a lot of lives. And there's the food arriving, and next slide, please. And the food, next slide, please. Food being distributed, bringing hope and healing for people who are at risk of death. Next slide, please. And children's pictures, always so powerful. The Antonov dropping the bombs. And next slide, please. And the bomb falling in a rain of terror, literally. Next slide, please. And Nigeria, we don't hear much about on the news, but there's a lot of very good interfaith work going on in the people we work with. But over recent decades, tens of thousands of Christians have been killed, hundreds of churches burnt, and many Muslims who will not adhere to the Islamist regime of ISIS and the other Islamist regimes, they've also been killed. Statistics: attacks led by Islamist militia continue in northern states and Middle Belt, with almost daily reports of killings, mayhem, rape, sex abuse, abductions, and enslavement, mass forced displacement, and land grabs. The precise death toll is unknown, but these figures are minimal, not maximum. According to human rights group Into Society, in December 2020, 34,400 Christians have been killed. Do we hear about that? Over 34,000 Christians killed since 29, and in 17,000, including 17,000 by Boko Haram and many others by Islamist Fulani. Displacement, according to the UN, in June 21, there were 2.9, nearly 3 million internally displaced peoples in northeastern Nigeria, many more displaced in Middle Belt, According to International Crisis Group, over 300,000 Nigerians have been displaced, and the British government is doing nothing to help them in Middle Belt. The escalation of Boko Haram's brazenness has created a reign of terror and intimidation. One tactic was to drive a suicide car bomb or motorbike into a church service and detonate it. Next slide, please. The next picture is a picture of a church in Jos, Plateau State, and I'm afraid we could show you many, many pictures like that. A church to which a suicide bomber had driven and exploded during a church service. Many Fulani herdsmen who used to roam through lands of vast herds of cattle have adopted an Islamist policy of attacking Christian villages, killing civilians, destroying homes, driving people off their lands and settling in their place, ethnic and religious cleansing. Next slide, please. This is just one of the churches destroyed in Jos, the University Church. Next slide, please. And talking to some of the survivors, and just a couple of stories, and there are hundreds of them. You've seen our report. We heard gunshots. 18 people were killed. Their bodies were set alight. They burned homes. An old man who couldn't run was killed. They came around 7 o'clock and left just before midnight. More than 200 of them in black cloth, well armed. Yesterday we lost another 19 of our people. And that's St. Timothy's Church in Jos, in the Plateau State, the capital of Plateau State. Next slide, please. That is St. Timothy's Church. Next slide, please. And we move finally, and just for a few seconds, or minutes, no more than minutes, to Syria. Next slide, please. We were there during the war, and driving from Damascus up to Aleppo, there's just constant devastation. This is the town of Malula, which is occupied by ISIS and other jihadist groups for 3 months. They destroyed everything. The people have now gone back and they've replaced the Madonna, but it's still full of desecration. Everything is desecrated. Next slide, please. And this was our first visit to Aleppo. We've been during the war. We've been several times since then. But you see the interfaith relations are very good. It's an Armenian who is the pastor who's really organizing the visit. But Heart is helping local women to return to Malula by supporting them as they collect and preserve fruit and vegetables to alleviate food shortages and to make some money to enable them to rebuild their homes. Next slide, please. And here are two of those brave, brave widows gone back to desolation and desecration, but trying to survive and rebuild their homes. And that's my colleague, Reverend David Thomas, and myself. Next slide, please, as we draw to a conclusion. Now, sanctions imposed by the West, including Britain, are causing horrific suffering. Desperate shortages of food and medicines leading to numerous deaths of innocent civilians. And I'm ashamed to say Britain still maintains sanctions, despite parliamentary pressure from me and quite a few other people to lift those sanctions. It's a war crime to maintain sanctions in a war zone. And as we draw to an end, this is an Armenian church in Aleppo. We were there during the war. Some of those children would have been killed since then. We were only 350 meters from the front line with the jihadists, and some of those would have been killed. But this is a powerful, powerful phrase, and I finish with this phrase because it's so powerful. The Chaldean Catholic priest said to us after that service, "Thank you for coming." He's like St. Thomas the Apostle, who put his hand into Christ's wounded hands and wounded side. You came to put your hands into the wounds of our suffering. Now you have seen our pain. You can believe, go and tell our story. That's what we try to do in Heart. We can't feel the suffering and the anguish of the people whom we visit, but we can, as you put it, put our hands into the wounds of their suffering and then try to help in ways that they ask and be advocates for them and tell the world what they are doing. And amongst our Christian friends and colleagues, pray, pray, pray for your prayers, please. Because so many of these are not known by our churches in Europe, and they much need your prayer. Thank you for letting me share the pain and the passion. Shat Shat Shnura Galutun.